In 2013, Kenyans went to the polls under the immense pressure of securing a peaceful transfer of power. Following the violence of 2007, the nation watched to see if the new constitutional framework would hold under closely contested local races. One of the most contentious battles emerged here, in Meru County, where the race for the governorship ended with a remarkably narrow margin of victory. The declared winner was Peter Munya, stepping into one of the most powerful regional offices. His challenger was Dickson Kithinji, an ordinary citizen and a local high school teacher. When Kithinji filed an election petition to challenge the results, he immediately faced a severe asymmetry of power. Challenging a sitting governor means litigating against an opponent with deep institutional resources. Before the courts will evaluate a single piece of evidence regarding ballot fraud or tallying errors, a petitioner must clear a procedural hurdle. They must deposit a financial bond to prove they can cover the winner's legal bills if the challenge fails. The justice system requires a direct financial cost of admission. This creates an immediate confrontation between a citizen's constitutional right to challenge a questionable election and their literal, upfront ability to pay for the privilege of a hearing. This scale shows the standoff. Left, the teacher earning 11,000 shillings monthly. Right, the governor's 4.8 million shilling security demand. The governor cited Rule 107, protecting officials from ruinous litigation. But this conflicts with Article 48, guaranteeing every citizen's right of access to justice. The Court of Appeal had to resolve this standoff. They rejected the governor's 4.8 million shilling demand, capped the required security deposit at 500,000 shillings. The court anchored their decision in statutory logic. Parliament had already set a 500,000 shilling cap for election petitions at the trial level. The court applied that same logic to the appeal, ruling that astronomical legal fees cannot be used to block a legitimate constitutional challenge. With the procedural bottleneck finally cleared and the 500,000 shillings deposited, the teacher was permitted to present his substantive evidence of electoral fraud. This decision balances the competing rights defined by the court: the winner's right to be protected from legal costs, and the citizen's right to have their day in court without being blocked by a paywall. Once the evidence was finally heard, the outcome shocked the political establishment. The Court of Appeal sided with the teacher, nullified Governor Munya's election, and threw Meru County into political uncertainty. Governor Munya escalated the case to the Supreme Court, arguing the appellate judges exceeded their jurisdiction by reopening the factual record of the trial. The Supreme Court issued a severe rebuke of the lower court's ruling, identifying a critical flaw in their methodology: jurisdictional overreach. This architectural model demonstrates the boundaries established by Section 85A of the Elections Act. While the High Court evaluates both facts and law, the Court of Appeal is legally restricted to reviewing matters of law. There is a strict boundary between evaluating raw evidence, like witness testimony, and determining if a trial judge applied the correct legal statutes. Re-evaluating raw facts at the appellate level is prohibited. The Supreme Court found that the Court of Appeal violated Section 85A. Instead of reviewing legal interpretations, the appellate judges dug back into the raw, factual evidence of the ballot tallying to reach a secondary conclusion. The appellate system exists to test the application of legal principles. If an appellate court acts as a secondary trial court, constantly reweighing physical evidence, it destroys the finality of the trial and destabilizes the judicial process. To understand exactly how the Court of Appeal overstepped, we have to look at the specific physical evidence they used to justify firing the governor. The record showed documented administrative mistakes. There were errors in how results were entered and transposed onto the official electoral forms 35 and 36. But the evidence contained a critical limitation. These documented tallying errors only occurred in 7 specific polling stations. This network grid maps out the true scale of the Meru County election infrastructure. It consists of 953 individual nodes, one for every polling station. The Court of Appeal made a speculative leap. They took the verified errors from those 7 isolated stations and assumed they represented a systemic failure that compromised the remaining 946. The Supreme Court firmly rejected this logic. They ruled that an election cannot be invalidated based on what might have been. It can only be annulled on what actually was. This established the Supreme Court's anti-speculation principle. Procedural irregularities and human errors are inevitable in any large administrative system. To nullify a result, a petitioner must mathematically prove that specific, isolated errors were large enough to alter the final outcome. Statistical extrapolation is a legal fallacy in constitutional law. Overturning the sovereign will of the voters requires concrete proof of disenfranchisement, not an assumption derived from a tiny sample size. The appellate court's logic was driven by one highly intuitive but legally incorrect assumption: the belief that a close race is inherently suspicious. This data visualization shows the exact mathematics of Governor Munya's victory. Out of all the ballots cast, his winning margin was 3,436 votes. That is a sliver representing just 0.819% of the total electorate. Because that quantitative margin was so small, the Court of Appeal reasoned that even minor irregularities in a handful of polling stations could flip the final result. The Supreme Court dismantled this theory using the precise text of the Kenyan Constitution, Article 184. The Constitution dictates a simple requirement for gubernatorial elections: the candidate who garners the greatest number of votes wins. There is no minimum percentage threshold required to legitimize the victory. The Supreme Court clarified the precedent. A narrow margin serves as a red flag that justifies an initial scrutiny and recount. It does not, however, lower the legal burden of proof required to nullify the entire race. Under the strict mathematics of the Constitution, a victory margin of one single vote carries the exact same legal and democratic weight as a margin of 1 million votes. On May 30, 2014, the Supreme Court delivered its final, binding order. The appellate decision was quashed in its entirety. Governor Peter Munya was officially reinstated as the validly elected leader of Meru County, ending the political uncertainty. This legal battle defined the dual thresholds of Kenyan electoral justice. On the procedural side, the teacher was granted his right to be heard because the courts refused to let a massive security demand act as a financial barrier to justice. On the substantive side, the governor was protected from removal because the Supreme Court refused to let statistical speculation and jurisdictional overreach override hard numerical evidence. The integrity of an electoral system relies on this exact balance. The courts must remain financially accessible enough for any citizen to challenge power, while demanding a standard of proof so rigorous that the sovereign will of the people can never be overturned by assumption.